Judaism emerged among Semitic peoples, a term we often hear but might not fully understand. Before diving deeper into the origins of Judaism, it's important to explore who the Semites were and how their cultural and historical context contributed to the development of this religion. The terms Semitic originate from Shem, a biblical patriarch thought to be the ancestor of the Semitic peoples, including Hebrews, Arabs, and related groups. These labels, developed by Western scholars, draw from biblical references to categorize peoples primarily from Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, tracing their mythical lineage back to Abraham. The initial Semitic groups emerged from the mixing of the Sumerians, dark-skinned pioneers and early settlers of Mesopotamia, and nomadic, warlike groups from northern Eurasia. So who were these established communities of dark-skinned people with deep African cultural roots? These groups included Persian archers, who traced their lineage back to the Elamites, credited as the earliest civilizers of Iran. This is a depiction of a Persian archer, as seen in the Louvre Museum. The Sumerians, also referred to as Zalmat Gagadu, or people of blackheads, acknowledge their distinct physical appearance and cultural contributions. The Canaanites Phoenicians. We have covered this group quite extensively in a recent video. See the video description. The ancient people of Kemet, popularly called Egyptians today, celebrated as true pioneers of civilization. This is a depiction of a typical Egyptian found in the tomb of Rameses III, authentic African name, Ramesu Hekayunu. This dates back to 1200 BC. This blend of cultures and peoples gave rise to the Akkadians, with Sargon of Akkad founding his empire around 2300 BC, a significant historical figure marking the so-called Semitic entry into recorded history. This period follows roughly 300 years after the construction of the Great Pyramids in Africa. Due to their nomadic lifestyle, these early Semitic peoples spread throughout the so-called Near East over time. Indeed, the so-called Fertile Crescent, a region stretching from Mesopotamia to Egypt across West Asia and Northeast Africa, became a central area for Semitic migrations and settlements. This area is rich in historical and biblical narratives, showcasing the influence of Semitic groups in ancient texts. The Bible tells the story of Abraham leaving his homeland in Chaldea, Mesopotamia, to journey to Canaan, a land not originally his, that would eventually be inherited by his descendants. This narrative introduces the practice of nomadism among Semitic peoples as they move into new territories. However, from a scientific and historical perspective, it's clear that Semitic populations are not all direct descendants of a single ancestor named Abraham. As these groups spread out, they encountered a variety of influences and experienced different destinies, leading to the emergence of diverse Semitic populations with distinct identities and histories. These Semitic groups, from their earliest days, interacted with the civilizations of Sumer, Canaan, and Egypt, regions heavily influenced by African cultures. The Bible acknowledges these interactions, depicting waves of nomadic Semites settling in Canaan, where they encountered the original inhabitants, sedentary black Canaanites with close ties to Egypt, who had lived in the area for thousands of years before the Semitic migrations. Many Semitic nomads from Mesopotamia ultimately made their homes in Canaan, drawn by its relative prosperity, and described biblically as the land flowing with milk and honey. Others continued on to Egypt, a major center of the African world in antiquity. The African world of the ancient Near East, particularly under Egyptian influence, interacted with these Semitic newcomers. Egyptian texts often referred to the various Semitic groups collectively as Asians, reflecting a broad category rather than specific ethnic or national identities. The term Asia, now used to refer to the continent, actually comes from an ancient Egyptian word that meant the East or Eastern to our ancestors. So when they referred to Semitic groups as Asians, they were simply indicating that these people originated from the eastern regions. These eastern groups, or Asians, were known by various names depending on the context, including the Amu, the Shasu, the Hekakasut, known in Greek as Hyksos, the Habaru, Long before Semitic groups arrived in Egypt, our ancestors were already aware of them. The Egyptians, in particular, were familiar with nomadic tribes known for their notoriety as raiders, among other things, who roamed the ancient Near East in pursuit of loot. On occasions, Egypt would step in, especially in Canaan, to quell any raids or unrest these groups caused. In the tomb of Khnumhotep II, an authentic pharaonic fresco, dating back to around 1900 BCE, documents the first official entry of a group of about 40 Semites into Egypt, led by their chief. This artwork enables us to follow their presence in Egypt from this period. The fresco depicts these Semites, identifiable by their tanned skin, entering Egypt peacefully and officially for the first time, with the Egyptians engraved at the bottom. It illustrates the Semites coming to pay tribute to the pharaoh, signifying their subjection to Egyptian authority. Two Egyptians, distinguished by their white loincloths, are shown documenting the tribute brought by the Semites. In this fresco of the Akhtatou, created in the 11th century, is rooted in biblical stories. It illustrates a moment from the Bible where Abraham and his wife visit Egypt and encounter the pharaoh, who is shown seated on his throne. Notably, this fresco, made many centuries ago, reflects a recognition of the African heritage of the ancient Egyptians. This suggests that the understanding of Egypt's African roots was widely acknowledged at the time the fresco was crafted, indicating a historical appreciation for the diverse origins of ancient civilizations. When Semitic groups first ventured into the regions inhabited by African peoples, such as the Canaanites and Egyptians, they were predominantly polytheistic. It was through interactions with these African communities that they were introduced to monotheism and its associated practices. An interesting account from the book of Genesis, chapter 14, verses 18 to 19, highlights this cultural exchange. It describes how Melchizedek, the king of Salem and a priest of the Most High God, welcomed Abram, later known as Abraham, with bread and wine, blessing him in the name of God, the Lord of heaven and earth. This encounter is crucial because it shows that Melchizedek, a Canaanite king, was already a follower of monotheism before Abraham's arrival in Canaan, the land that would later become known as ancient Palestine. This implies that the African Canaanites, like their neighbors in the Nile Valley, practiced monotheism before the arrival of Abram, who is often considered the first monotheist in Semitic religious traditions. In essence, the Bible inadvertently reveals that monotheism was already established among the African peoples at the time Abram entered their lands. Furthermore, the passage where Melchizedek blesses Abram underscores that the very first monotheistic rituals Abram participated in, such as sharing meals of bread and wine, were African in origin. These rituals, long present in the Nile Valley civilizations like Egypt and Sudan, were part of the worship of Osiris and were shared with Abram by King Melchizedek, highlighting the African roots of some of the earliest monotheistic practices. The story of Abraham and other nomadic figures in the Bible, such as Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, highlights how Semitic peoples adopted monotheism and various cultural practices from African communities, specifically the Canaanites and Egyptians. These interactions are depicted in biblical narratives, showcasing how these early Semitic nomads integrated customs and religious rites from the advanced civilizations they encountered in Africa. This exchange of ideas and practices underscores the significant influence that African civilizations had on the development of Semitic cultures and religious beliefs. The term Hebrews in the Bible initially refers to a few individuals like Abraham and Jacob and their families, rather than a distinct people. When these patriarchs and their groups arrived in Canaan or Egypt, they were not enslaved, and the concept of a Hebrew people developed over time. Real historical events likely inspired the biblical narratives about the Hebrews, a people whose existence is primarily scriptural. The word Hebrew itself likely comes from Habir or Apir, terms found in ancient texts from Egypt and Canaan, used pejoratively to describe scattered, nomadic Semitic groups. These terms did not originally refer to a distinct people or a language. The story of the Exodus, as told in the Bible, where the Hebrew people escaped slavery in Egypt and journeyed to the Promised Land, lacks historical evidence. Sheikh Antajob, in his book Nations Nègres et Culture, provides insights that may explain the origins of this biblical narrative. Job suggests that Moses lived during the era of Pharaoh Akhenaten, around 1400 BCE, a time when Akhenaten attempted to revitalize Egypt's ancient monotheism. This religious reform aimed at creating a unified religion to support the political unity of Egypt's vast empire. Moses, influenced by these reforms, is portrayed as adopting monotheism passionately within his community. This context is set in the 18th dynasty, a period of immense Egyptian power and expansion under Pharaoh Thutmose III. During this time, Egypt was a melting pot of people from its conquered territories who came for work, to settle, or to pay tribute. Job places this transformative period specifically during Akhenaten's reign, suggesting that the biblical Exodus narrative might have been inspired by historical interactions and the significant religious reforms of that era. Akhenaten revolutionized Egyptian religious practices by discontinuing the worship of various manifestations of the Creator, called deities. These deities are Osiris, Isis, Hathor, and Anubis, which priests traditionally mediated. Instead, he established the monotheistic worship of the Aten, the sun disk, as the sole expression of the divine, allowing only himself to conduct its worship. Akhenaten's actions position him as a unique figure in history, akin to the first prophet, centralizing religious power and practice around this singular deity. Egyptologists and other Western scholars with little to no understanding of African culture and religiosity have erroneously assumed these manifestations of Imana as separate gods. We will discuss the manifestations of the Creator later in this video. The biblical account of the Hebrews entering and settling in Palestine, described as the Promised Land, was marked by significant violence and brutality, echoing the actions of the Hyksos and Haberu, ancient groups known for their aggressive conquests. Scholars have drawn parallels between these groups and the Hebrews of the Bible, especially in their treatment of the Canaanites. According to biblical directives, the Canaanites were to be exterminated to claim their land and possessions for Israel, a narrative detailed in the book of Joshua. However, the actual conquest of Canaan by the Semitic populations might not have happened as swiftly or directly as the Bible suggests. Historical evidence, such as the Merneptah stele from 1207 BCE, indicates that Egypt maintained control over Canaan well into the period following the 18th dynasty, contradicting the timeline of an immediate post-Exodus conquest. The Semites' integration into Canaanite society was a gradual process, involving cultural assimilation and the adoption of Canaanite languages, which later came to be recognized as Semitic. This slow blending and eventual autonomy led to the establishment of the political entities of Judah and Israel around 1000 BCE. These developments occurred in the context of regional shifts, including the decline of traditional powers like Egypt and the arrival of new groups such as the Sea Peoples, shaping a complex and evolving landscape in the ancient so-called Near East. The emergence of Judaism and its foundational texts can be seen as a response to political upheaval and the need to unify a people with a shared history, ideology, and laws. As the Assyrian and Babylonian empires overran the Canaanite region, previously protected by the declining Pharaonic Empire, the Semitic kingdoms of Israel and Judah were destroyed in 722 BC and 587 BC, respectively. This led to the dispersion of the Semites and the legend of the lost tribes of Israel. Upon their return to Canaan, these communities sought to reconstruct their nations and identity. The creation of Judaism as the religion for this nation, along with the drafting of holy scriptures, served as the foundation for rebuilding. The Hebrew Bible, or Tanakh, was crafted during this period, encapsulating the nation's history, laws, and religious beliefs. This project aimed to foster a sense of national pride and identity by introducing concepts such as the chosen people and people of God. Scholarship attributes much of the work on the Hebrew Bible to Ezra, a priestly scribe, who is credited with